Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Inspector Goals episode 2 of the new season. Joined today by a very dear friend, Johnny Curry, JC, FPL Spaceman, all of the above. Um, Johnny, absolute pleasure to have you. How are you keeping?
Pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm excited. New season starting soon. I feel like I'm both exhausted and ready to go in all in one. So yeah, how are you?
Good, good. I suppose not much has changed in terms of, minutes and players and who we're going to buy and drafts and things like that. But hopefully, over the course of this evening, going to look to dive into some maybe more in depth stuff around our plans, kind of general structures, general approaches to things like expected minutes, risk. Look at maybe a couple of drafts just to talk, I suppose, more about risk and maybe some alternative paths and things like that. And then some stuff on kind of free transfer valuation. I suppose the biggest change over the last, I guess, this season is the new rules around 5 free transfers. And we're going to dive into that more, but I suppose just initially your reactions, I guess, over the changes. How are you feeling about that going into the new season?
Yeah, I think it's a good one. I think there's actually been a few seasons in a row where there's not been much change, and the chips used to change around quite a bit before, and I think it's been overdue. I think it's a good one that sort of helps managers who forget about their teams and come back. So it should help their engagement, which I think is what the guys who run FPL are more interested in. But also it gives us a new interesting problem as a sort of perhaps a side effect of what they're trying to do. Yeah, so it's been some really interesting discussions on how we adapt to the new change and what does it mean. And I think having played a few other different formats that sort of are a bit more similar to this, it's nice to be able to kind of bring that across and adapt and see what everyone else is thinking too.
Yeah, and I suppose with that, a lot of thinking going into the new season, a lot of planning and things like that. I think before we get into the nitty gritty, I suppose, important to recognise that yourself and a few others are kind of working on a new tool, which is a really exciting project. Really looking forward to kind of seeing what comes of that. Anything you want to say about that, or kind of talk about the new tool that's coming?
Yeah, I think just we're really excited too. So that's myself, Sir Talp, Trout, and Jorgen, who most people will be familiar with. Certainly, if you're in our analytics Discord server. But yeah, we're hoping to bring out a new innovative tool. We've had a few ideas that we think could really change the way people think about it, and can't give too much details. But we're trying to like make it state of the art, user friendly. So that'll be launching in early 2025. So there's a link in the description. Proper YouTube stuff, aren't we? Professional. Or it's fploptimized.com/sign up. You can sign up to the newsletter where we're going to post updates on how things are developing and things closer to launch so we can reveal a bit more. But for now, it's super secret. And yeah, we're excited. I feel like I want to tell people, but I've been informed I mustn't just yet. So
Yeah,
my hands are tied.
I think it's great. Just generally, whoever it is, just kind of looking to improve the game, generally improve FPL and how we view it. Whether that's FPL themselves changing the rules and trying out new things, more free transfers, a new chip, but we'll talk about more, and just different changes. And then from our point of view as nerds, I guess nice to kind of have new things to look forward to in terms of how we approach the game. We've all been spending the last couple of weeks since the new rules were announced kind of thinking about it, and we will get into that later on, and we might talk about kind of how we're feeling about that. But yeah, it's great to see that kind of in the new year that there's something kind of exciting coming that we can look forward to.
The mystery chip, that is. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what we're calling it now. Yeah, that is the new mystery chip, right?
So it's a continuation of some of the work we've been doing already. So I think like Sir Talp's already revamped the way people think about FPL as well as some of Trout's work. So I think it's people are building things. So actually, this is kind of bubbling to the surface, and this is like us announcing that we want to do more with it, rather than sort of suddenly emerging and going, yeah, we can build a tool. Why not?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been really good fun to work on and engage with the community as well on what they think and what they want, and yeah, make that step. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, brilliant. And again, link is in the description to newsletter where I suppose people can go and sign up. I'm sure most people here probably already have, but if there's anybody who hasn't, newsletter is in the description. Sign up, and then any of the kind of any announcements that we hear, that's where to find out before anybody else does. So I suppose the first kind of topic then around FPL and our planning so far, and kind of just a general kind of macro discussion, I suppose, around kind of expected minutes. I think generally, I suppose in FPL, it's probably expected minutes probably one of the biggest kind of edges and the biggest unknowns really in terms of the best way to approach them. That we can kind of look to work on. We can spend hours and hours talking about who the best 5.5 mil mid is, or who's going to get 10 or 11 goals, but really it's trying to figure out the minutes of those players that's really important. The players that are on the pitch are obviously the ones we want, and we're going to try and discuss, I suppose, how we approach X-Mins, and I'm going to pass the question to you in a second around that. What some of your kind of general thoughts are around that. I suppose some of the maybe common mistakes that we might see from really engaged managers, ourselves included, right? We all make mistakes, and maybe look at some of the approaches that other people take, as well as kind of the importance of, I guess, collaborating with others. So I guess to start off there, in terms of X-Mins, how do you kind of approach it? What are your kind of overarching kind of thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think it's the thing that people talk about as being like the last edge, which I think isn't true, but it is something that is computers can't do it quite as well as we can, and obviously it's something that does need that human input in terms of understanding tactics. And I don't know, I think I was listening to Ted Knutson, who was obviously been on FPL podcast recently, talk on the transfer flow about like, do they, when he's doing a sports betting, are they listening to the press conferences? And it's like, no, this is relevant. They're all lying, and we spend all this time thinking about it, and that's fun. There's an element of like, if you want to spend time doing something, it's not wasted, but also it's like understanding what's relevant and what from preseason is relevant to the future minutes. So like people talk about, oh, he scored a goal, that means he's more likely to play, and actually it's not really that relevant. So I think the way I try and approach it is to try and like, I guess, keep it simple. Like, what do I actually think is information I should be looking out for that's going to affect X minutes moving forward? So like, if there's someone I trust who knows a club well, who's talking about some tactical shift that's going to mean players are going to come in and out, I'll listen to that. If there's some quote from Pep saying that I don't know, he's not quite ready, then like maybe that's not as relevant. I think as well there's an issue with like some of the murkier X minutes positions is like actually trying to make sure that you are balancing it out and you're not predicting more than 11 times 90 or 95 minutes, whatever your scale is, of minutes across a team. So I'll try and look at it a bit more pessimistically and be like, okay, like how low can his X minutes go and him still be a good option? And then if that threshold is really low, then it's easy to just be like, okay, like he should be in. But there are different kind of player types. There's different like X minutes distributions. So someone we were talking a bit about earlier was like a player called like Gabriel, who like might miss a game, but is probably going to play most of them. And if he misses, it's going to be probably missing the whole game. Maybe it does come on later. Whereas someone, I'm trying to think, early on, I guess maybe like what Foden used to be. Foden obviously is now quite nailed, but like a Man City attacker. It's like, okay, like maybe we go Oscar Bob early on. Like, is he gonna? He might start the first game, but then he becomes an issue later, and actually he's very likely to cameo. So his projected minutes, even if they were the same as Gabriel, his distribution is going to be very different. So I think understanding the number that we often come up with to put into the model to generate the expected value output is actually this, not even the central point, it's the average of the distribution of expected minutes. And that's where it's a bit funny playing around with, like the expected goals is also sort of so it's applying that across to minutes. Even the term X mins is like, where did that come from? Who came up with that? It's just like playing time. And sometimes as well, in terms of the team models, you can think about a player's goal share as like a share of the total goals of the team, and maybe that has playing time mixed into it rather than just being the share of the goals while they're on the pitch and then the playing time in it, so you can double. I was talking to 11ify about this in some of his modeling. It's like, actually, if you model over a longer period, you're going like, okay, what share of the goals this season are they going to score? So I think there's a lot to play around with, and it's still something that gets confusing. But
Yeah.
also, as long as you're not near the tipping point of players interacting with each other, don't really have to worry about it too much. And obviously, early season, you drop a player down 10x mins, and the whole team changes, and you're like, oh god, what have I done? So that's where it's tricky to
Yeah.
fiddle around. But
Yeah, I think probably for me, probably the most important point you touched on there is kind of being pessimistic around them. It's something that I like to do. Maybe even too much at times, being like too harsh on players' mins. I suppose generally the way that I kind of approach the game is, well, what happens if I'm wrong about whatever I think, or even whatever outputs I'm getting from a solver. So, for example, somebody like Gabriel, I mentioned this last week when I was speaking with Luke, that he's somebody that for me I'm probably just going to ban and avoid altogether. Now, do I think he's going to play every game? Yeah, I do. I'm pretty confident in that he will do
do you
that. But I
expect
suppose,
it?
yeah, we'll have to change the pod to inspected minutes soon. Yeah, like, do I think Gabriel's going to play? Yeah, like I do, but I don't really care about what I think in terms of minutes. Really, as an individual, I'm just one person. I think it's impossible to keep up with every team in the league and every player in the league. There's so much uncertainty around even some of the more nailed players in the league, that trying to kind of isolate, kind of remove yourself and your own opinions from it in one sense can be good. There are some people who don't need to do that, and who do know much more than I do about different players in the league, and more power to them. But for me, I suppose taking that step back and being more harsh on mins, I would rather, for example, in the Gabriel example, like, will I have an Arsenal defender? I don't know. I might not even have Saliba. Probably not. But in that example, I would rather start with Saliba. Gabriel ends up doing better. He plays all the mins, and I think I wish I owned him, but at the end of the day, I'm happy with that. If, for example, I started with Gabriel and then he misses game week 2 because of Calafiori or something, then I'm thinking, well, I think with a player like him, if he misses one game, that sets a bit of a dangerous precedent that maybe in 2 weeks' time Calafiori might play again. And we saw last year, I suppose, Gabriel, I know it's very anecdotal, but Gabriel getting dropped, and then there was people in a situation of kind of, he didn't start, whether he was dropped or not, I don't know, but he didn't play, and they were in a situation of, well, what do we do going forward with it? Do we need to use a transfer to do that? Do we not? I tend to be quite kind of protective of my free transfers, which we'll get into later, and it's just not something that I'm willing to, it's not a situation I'm really willing to put myself into. If you think of players then like Oscar Bob, or maybe someone who's coming up in more solves at the minute, maybe like Nkunku or João Pedro, players like that who kind of, their mins are very up for debate. Is it 60? Is it 75? Is it 80? Definitely up for debate there. Those players, I tend to just be harsher with them. So whatever kind of the consensus seems to be from general discussions with you or with other members who I think are quite intelligent when it comes to FPL and mins predictions in particular, I kind of just drop them a little bit. And like you said at the end there, you touched on it. If they're still showing up when I've been really harsh on their mins, they're probably going to be a good pick, right? If they don't show up anymore, well then, I'm super reliant on them matching those minutes. I think last season in game week 1, I started with João Pedro, and we saw throughout the season his EV was like really, really high. And even when you dropped João Pedro's mins to like 50s, we thought he was still showing up, right? And when a player, I mean, if you think João Pedro is going to start the games, his minutes are going to be higher than 50. Like, if you think he's going to be playing. And so that's when kind of being that bit more pessimistic, like João Pedro must have been really, really good if he was still showing up in solves when his minutes were in the high 40s or the low 50s, right? So I suppose I do want to touch on as well one other thing around X-Mins. I suppose we mentioned last week, myself and Luke, around kind of that being somewhere where we want the pod to go in one sense, kind of cater towards expected minutes. So I've been thinking about a few different ideas, and I would appreciate any sort of feedback or any ideas people have. What I've been thinking so far might be that, I suppose, each week or maybe every couple of weeks, because I mean realistically there's only 4 or 5 different players that are relevant per month in terms of X minutes. It's more now because it's pre-season, but maybe on the Twitter page, or in some of the Discord servers or whatever it might be, that we kind of send out some polls for people to vote on the kind of really important players around X Mins. So, say for example, like I mentioned earlier, Nkunku. It could be, what do you think Nkunku's expected minutes are for game week 1? And you vote between, maybe I put the options as, I don't know, 60 to 65, 65 to 70, 70 to 75, and 75 to 80 or whatever. And then we go to discuss the results then on the pod the following week. I think that could be really nice. But let me know what you guys think. I think it'd be nice to collaborate with everybody. I mentioned earlier kind of removing yourself from the decision in many ways. So I think that could be really useful for me anyways, if I had input from, 20 different people or whatever that might be. It could be a bigger number, it could be a smaller number, whatever that might be. Collaborating with others can kind of help to remove some of the biases that I might have around players' minutes. I know a similar kind of style of prediction for players and their playing time would be Emma or Jump the Wave, where every week for the key teams anyways is kind of predictors who would say who they think is going to start. And it's kind of a similar approach to that, where maybe there's 20 people who vote on the X-Mins of Nkunku, we get an average, and then we discuss that.
I think that like collaborative nature is really important and useful, because it's one of those things where you can be slightly blindsided or have missed a player that you hadn't really thought about and go, actually, people are talking about this guy. And that's where the community aspect really comes in, because no one person, well, unless it's their full-time job, even then, is going to know 20 clubs inside and out and be following and tracking all the news and everything and what's going on. So I think that community aspect is really good for collaborating. But again, your decision is still something at the end of it, because what you're doing is you're kind of gauging a sentiment from the wisdom of the crowd. But you're still welcome to disagree with it if you feel strongly enough. But I think it's useful data to kind of look at and go, okay, like, this is something I don't specifically know about. That's fine. I'll look at other data sources and sort of see what other people are thinking. The thing with the predicted lineups and the this sort of sentiment on people voting on those different things is like, I think this is kind of how like weather reporting goes. When you see that like percentage chance of rain of wherever you are,
100
is actually that's kind of a blend of what? Sorry,
100.
100.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, up in Scotland it is. It's good now. That's actually a blend of coverage and certainty. So actually, it's like, okay, how much of this area is going to be rained on, and how certain are the predictors that's this data. The data profile is showing that about 50% of the time, when it follows this data profile, it'll rain or it won't. So there's a blend of the two, and I think that's something that we don't quite get with the predictors at the minute, or people don't quite understand that actually we're only getting one of the other. So if you get one person's predictions, then sometimes you'll see, okay, this is the predicted lineup, and here's some certainty I have on these players. So I know some of the Man City predictors used to post their lineups, and they'd have like a little bar underneath it and be like, okay, Haaland is in, and I'm 100% sure he's going to play. Grealish is on the left, and I'm only 60% sure. So actually, although they're both in the lineup, then the certainty isn't the same. And what you get from the aggregated predictors is you get the opposite one, which is, okay, you get like a, in or out binary. Here's my 11.
Yeah.
But you get a set of them so you can see how often that player is appearing. So I wonder if there's stuff we can do to try and like blend the two, or how we can best show them. But yeah, I'll actually be working with Emma this season. I did some stuff with her on the Newcastle predictors. But I'm going to be taking over the data side for her for the predictors. So I'm going to shout her out. She does some great work.
Yeah.
Again, link in the description. Hopefully, I did ask Swish. But we are looking for a few more predictors. We're a bit short on Chelsea, Spurs, and Man City, especially, I think. So just reach out to myself or Emma at Jump the Wave on Twitter if you're a fan of that team or knowledgeable even. I know Luke used to do the Man City ones, and I predict Newcastle as a fan, but actually I'm not sure if I'm especially knowledgeable on them. It's probably the team I know the best, but sometimes people ask me questions and I'm like, you seem to have more info than I do. I support them rather than divide, I'm going to know this team well. So there's stuff to be gained from there, and I think there's a lot of work to do in how do we aggregate these and how do we best display the results, interpret the results. There might even be betting markets on these expected minutes at some point, in which case we just hand it all over to them and trust the solver, and that's
Yeah.
then where are we? But
Yeah.
at the moment, yeah, I think it's nice to kind of work together on this stuff, because
Yeah.
even if you're agreeing and working together on this, your team's individual. Like you make different decisions from the same data, and I feel it's nice to. Well, it's talking about football. That's kind of what
Yeah.
most people playing FPL like to do.
Yeah.
I think we forget that at the end of the day is we're all really nerdy football guys who want to talk about football. So that's X-Mins is he going to play here? Is he going to play there?
Yeah.
And that's the important bit,
yeah.
because is this person looking to pass to this person is going to move the needle whether they score? Not very much. But is he playing every game now? That's, well, if your rate of scoring is the same and you're going from playing every other game to playing every game, your rate's doubled basically.
I think minutes predictions as well. Like it's a really good way for anybody who might be feeling a little bit, I suppose. Maybe some people at times might fall out of love with just using a solver, or using kind of approaching the game analytically, or anybody who hasn't done it in the past and is a bit kind of apprehensive. I suppose being able to predict minutes is something that you really do need to be in tune with football for, as an individual, right? If I'm going to try and sit down and predict how many goals a player is going to score, I'm not going to be very good at doing that, no matter how hard I try, how much I watch it. The betting markets are always just going to be better, right? But if I'm sitting down and I'm thinking how many minutes are they going to play, then I do think that there's scope there for kind of your brain to be able to be. I mean, we don't, as you mentioned, we don't have betting markets there that can help us with it. So it is much more down to just individuals thinking about it. Yeah, exactly. And when it does, then we'll delete this video and we'll just click solve. But yeah, I think it's a nice way for people to. I mean, for me, I don't really care. I completely see football, and FPL is completely different. But anybody who struggles with that could be kind of a bit of motivation, I suppose, or a bit of I'm not sure what the term might be, but a different way to view it, I guess, and maybe to find some joy in the EV if you can't do that purely based on the expected points themselves. But yeah, I think as well, you kind of touched on it as well, a sense check from your own beliefs, right? I think that Nkunku is going to play 80 minutes in game week 1, and then 20 other people think he's going to play 65. I'm probably wrong. Like it's kind of a way to look at it, right? Like I'm not smarter than the 20 other smart people who voted on this, so I'm probably wrong. Or the opposite, right? For me, I tend to be really harsh on minutes. I'd be in the camp of Nkunku. I'd be setting his minutes at, I mean, I don't know. We'll see next week, but I'd be like mid 60s or something, right? Or whatever. I don't know. I don't actually have a number. High 60s, let's say. If we do a poll next week and everybody thinks he's going to play 77 minutes is the average, I'm probably going to think, okay, maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh. I'm going to bump them up by a little bit. I'm still probably inevitably going to be a little bit pessimistic about it, but I'm going to be more willing to be open to I'm open to being wrong, right? I think that's quite important.
I think also it's kind of just understanding what your position is relative to the field on it. So like you might still be like, okay, I think it's 65 and everyone's thinking it's 75, but so I am going to temper it down a little bit, but also I'm like, okay, I'm lower on Nkunku than other people are.
Yeah.
And actually that's just something to be aware of. And maybe that's something you don't actually have to change, but it's something you go, oh, okay, I didn't realize that people were so high on him.
Yeah.
Which plays in.
Yeah. I think for the most part that probably kind of covers most things. I mean, it's so in depth that we could probably spend another 2 hours talking about minutes and how we approach it, and then individual players and how we're going to talk about them.
Next episode.
Yeah, I think that the individual players themselves. What minutes is Nkunku going to play? What minutes is João Pedro going to play? I don't know. I don't think you know. I don't think anybody here knows just yet. We'll have a better guess to make next week when we get a little bit closer, a little bit more information.
We don't know, do we?
Yeah, we just don't.
That's why people spend so much time in pre-season doing stuff and figure things out. I'm like, I don't know.
I mean, you've brought out a whole new tool. I started working on a whole new tool because there's nothing else. Well. There's nothing else to talk about just yet. But yeah, the minutes themselves right now, we'd be wasting our time if we spoke on it on a player level, really. So as we get closer to deadline, I think things will become a little bit more clear. But in terms of kind of general approach, I think that works well enough. There might be one other. I guess I'm just going to bring up here a table here that was shared with me by a member of the analytics Discord, the one hosted actually by Sertop, goes by Up, and he kindly sent me on this graph here. Again, really kind of basic kind of sample of just some of the work that some people put into their X-Min's predictions. Just going to make sure that's come up for me there. Going to bring up here. Yeah, so just a really kind of basic sample. Now, this player in this graph doesn't actually exist. It's just based off a sample that Up came up with of somebody who might be expected to start 70% of the time. And it's made some kind of, I suppose, estimations around the chance that somebody doesn't play. So we have a 5% chance somebody doesn't play. And it just kind of shows some of the distributions that are in within the X-Men's work that people put in. I'm not sure, Johnny, have you looked into kind of tables like this? I know in the past, like Up's work, really, really good, and to be honest, really, really useful. The tables themselves, I mean, sometimes they go over my head, to be honest, and then I wait for 20 other people to talk about it and discuss it, and then when we come to a conclusion, then I jump in and say, yes, I agree with everybody else. Yeah, that's really, really good work, guys. And then I copy the output from that.
Yeah, I think I don't always do tables like this, but it's good. I think it shows the kind of like how the distribution pans out, and once you've got a feel for that, then actually you can kind of do it without the table. I think it's when I'm getting a bit confused, or I'm not quite sure, or maybe the distribution's like a bit unusual or different to similar players. Then I'll go, okay, like I'm not sure, and I'll try and work out like what do my beliefs translate to as an X-Min's number. And sometimes I get a little bit stuck with it. Sometimes you can just get a feel for it and do it off, not quite off the top of your head, but I feel this. And actually, like when you're tinkering around like between 80 and 90 minutes, you're like, well, this guy's pretty much going to start. It's just how much do I think he's going to stay on, or is there a small chance that he doesn't play? Or if it's a goalkeeper, then you're basically just predicting how likely it is that they start or not, because I'm not sure we've seen goalkeeper tactical subs yet. I don't see, they can get injured. So I think this is still really useful. But once you get an idea of that distribution, I think from some of my like work on modeling different games, obviously the points scale, like not, you don't just get point per minute or anything. Once you hit 60, you get that extra minute.
Yeah.
And then in some games, like if you play 90 minutes as an attacker, then you get an extra point for that. So it's almost like converting it into probabilities of playing 1 to 59, 60 to 89, and 90 minutes, and none. So it's more important, how does the distribution fit into those kind of categories, rather than like worrying about whether the sub on is going to be 20 minutes or 10 minutes, because actually like that's just kind of just 1 point. So you can go into a lot of detail, but
I think generally, like myself, probably more than most, even like we tend to spend too long like worrying about nothing really. Is it 82 minutes or is it 84? Like it doesn't really matter. If I drop them by 5, are they still there? We talked about this at the beginning. If I drop them by 5, are they still there? Okay, they're good. If they're gone, then they're quite kind of sketchy, right? I need to be really confident in what I think their minutes are going to be. So I think like 82 versus 84 and things like that. We'll get into that later about maybe some of the other areas that we're going to discuss. But I think just generally to be quite, I say it all the time, trying to be robust in everything you do really around FPL. And that includes the minutes that you predict for the players that are there. And I suppose probably for me, the one, along with kind of trying to be as robust as I can and as flexible as I can, also kind of from maybe a psychological point of view, what if I'm wrong? Like, how am I going to feel? Like, which side do I want to be on there? Am I happier if I start with Gabriel and I get it wrong, or if I don't start with him and I get it wrong? What are my thoughts?
It's funny you say, if it goes wrong, how am I going to feel? Because I was thinking, like, if it goes wrong, what am I going to do next? Like, how do I fix this? Rather than like, how does it impact me? But I feel like I'll ride any wave into oblivion or
we've been there.
Victory or whatever. But yeah, I think it's important to kind of play around with these.
Um,
I like playing around and kind of seeing, because the way each, the players all link together, it's like this sort of network or like ecosystem, also, almost. I think that's what I said on my very first pod was set up was if you can get an understanding of how that ecosystem interacts. So like if I drop this player, it starts to favor this one. Then you can see where those tipping points are, and that's where you put your X-Min's predictive effort. If you imagine you've got like a finite amount, like where am I going to put this? And it's probably not on getting Haaland right between 85 and 90.
yeah.
Well, it might be. I don't know. Maybe that is the tipping point. Maybe I haven't done enough solving yet. But you can see where it's relevant and where you put your effort in, and actually where it's, great. You can be more accurate, but you're not actually trying to predict your points total. You're trying to maximize it. So, you don't get points for having accurately predicted how many points you're going to get.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, I probably mentioned about 10 minutes ago that's the end of the X-Min's talk, and then proceeded to go into detail about X-Min's distributions and tables. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, we are going to move on from that for now. Again, there's probably more, 3 or 4 hours more we could spend on it. The next kind of topic we want to look at, maybe around risk. I know there's a lot of questions that came in, particularly when when people found out that you were going to be on the pod around risk. And so I'm going to start off with you. Risk, what does that mean? How do you approach it in FPL?
What does it mean? I think to me it means how aggressive and how fun is it going to be, or how simple am I going to play it. But basically, risk is, there's two types of risk. There's objective risk and there's relative risk. So I think it's almost another poor choice of term, because people say I'm playing risky, and it's like, well, actually, you can play safe but have a very different team, and is that risky? And so that's why I think it means two things. So we should really distinguish between the two. So objective risk is like inherently how likely is it that things go wrong for my team. So if I pick Darwin Nunez, then he might start, he might not. He might score a hat trick from small chances. He might miss 10 sitters in a row. It's just, he's a bit volatile. His like range of outcomes is really large. Whereas if I pick James Ward-Prowse, then he'll play the game, and he might score a free kick if he gets one, and that's that. He'll, I probably know what he's going to do. Yeah. And actually, more of it comes in with team structures. So you build a team where if this player gets injured, you have to move the funds around and you struggle, and it's a sort of risky in the sense that it's a bit fragile. And then relative risk is like how different are your teams relative to the field. So what are your expected gains on the field? And this is the thing that I think people are more interested in, is like, how do I find a differential or this sort of hidden gem, which doesn't really exist when there's 11 million people playing the game. Probably I don't think anyone's really hidden. But it might be someone who's not very well owned, or you have strong beliefs in and other people don't, and you pick them. And I know we all did very well from Douglas Luiz last season, because the model liked him taking pens and getting bonus, and not a lot of people had him, so we did very well there. But actually, objectively, maybe it wasn't super a risky pick, because he's probably going to play and he's probably going to keep his pens. Like how bad could it? Might get injured. So I think it's balancing those two. And I think the analogy I used in our risk pod, if I'm plugging things again, on FPL Optimized, was that you have a distribution of outcomes again, of like, okay, my EV is somewhere in the middle, and I might score more than it, and I might score less than it, and that's, you could call it a normal distribution. And I want to maximize the chance of me doing really, really well. And maybe there's a threshold of like, I want to come top 100k or top 10k or wherever. So you're trying to maximize your area under this chart. I guess I'm moving my hands, but it's beyond Spotify layer. So in order to do that, I can either shift the whole distribution that way towards, more points, and that will move the whole thing, or I can like stretch it. So I can increase the range. There's a threshold of like, so if I keep the central point where it is and I stretch it, then I'm more likely to do really well, but I'm also more likely to do really poorly. And you do that by having essentially different players. So if we believe that Haaland and Salah have the same projected points or near enough in a game week, and I know that everyone's captaining Haaland, if I captain Salah, then my objective risk hasn't really changed, like unless we think that one of them's more risky than the other in terms of getting injured. But my relative risk, my gain is either going to be really big or really my loss is going to be really big because everyone's got Haaland and I don't. Whereas if I captain Haaland, then my ranges are narrower because I'm moving with the field or without the field. So I'm less likely to get left behind. So there's a real balance at the start of the season because right at the end, you can see roughly where you're ranked, or even in your mini league, like how many points do I need to catch? How much risk do I need? And also, there's much less ramifications of engaging in that risk because you don't have the knock-on effects of picking a player that not many people own, and then if he gets dropped, maybe his price drops, and you've missed out on the price rises of the other guy, and all those knock-on effects. And if you bring a risky player in and you've already wild-carded, then it's quite hard to get rid of him, and he becomes a problem later, and all of that. So right at the start of the season, I think objective risk should be generally minimized, and actually relative risk will kind of come to you. And I think actually, like, you can pick a pretty template team and then just react differently to the information, especially if there's like a template structure that's like really standing out. I think this is something that kind of made more sense when I was talking to Bridge Amateur is one of the guys in the Discord server about Sky, because we had like a separate overhaul in the middle of the season, and actually it looked pretty straightforward, like who to pick on that. But I wanted to try and gain some rank because I wasn't quite where I wanted to be. And actually, I was like looking for places like where can I pick a different player or a different structure, and it just wasn't really. It looked like it was too much of a gamble. But pick the same team to start with. There's still lots of time left. You can just react differently, and actually, you end up on a different path, and that takes you miles away from everyone else. And I ended up on like a quintuple Arsenal defense, which came in quite well when they kept a few clean sheets in a row. So that would, because then everyone else went for like Saka and Odegaard and whatever. So you can pick quite an objectively template team and react better. Like we've got 38 game weeks. If you don't need to like force a player in. If there's players that kind of pop up and go, okay, like, oh, there's two paths and one of them is quite different. I quite like taking the different path just because I find it more interesting, and in some ways more fun. But I think that's sometimes to my detriment. I think I know how to turn the risk up, but I'm not very good at turning it down. So I think if I'm really high ranked, not as good at sort of defending a lead if I'm evaluating my own playstyle. But also, this is a free game that doesn't really matter. So if I can express myself by doing some really weird things, and some people seem to find that fun to follow along, then yeah, I'll happily throw my season away at the end with no Haaland on Wildcard 35 just to make people laugh.
Yeah.
I still think it was a good idea, but it didn't work at all.
Yeah, it's a silly game really that we play.
But yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, I think you put that really, really eloquently. I think the first thing that stood out to me, you mentioned around what's going to be the most fun pick, or what's going to be the most fun path or something. And this will kind of lead me into my next point, which I find for me, the risk that I tend to find in the game, I suppose there's two main aspects. One would be just around captaincy week to week. What's everybody doing? If there's somebody who has the same expected points, I'm probably going to do the other one, to kind of just gain that little bit of risk each week, and that really does stack up over the season. And also, I think you mentioned, like, you kind of touched on this a lot around starting with, like, it's fine to start with whatever, a template team or a really shared team amongst really engaged managers. What I've found in the past is that just like being patient is actually one of the best ways to kind of get some outcome variability to the field. So I'm somebody, again, if you were to ask the three people who I speak to, how I might approach the game, really passively, don't really make many transfers. I might say safe or something, I don't know. I'll happily admit myself probably overly protective of transfers and don't like to make too many. Sit there and just roll and use one transfer and roll again and so on. But by 6, 7, 8 weeks into the season, I might have started with the same team as everybody else, but now they've all made 6 transfers and I've made 3 or whatever. I've made much less. And so our teams are different already. And now when we continue into game week 8, 9, 10, our teams are already so different that every single move that you make just it becomes exponential. You end up wildcarding at different times, whatever else, right? The season changes completely chip strategy as well. I think somewhere that we can really kind of find risk in like overarching kind of paths. How am I going to find some kind of variability to the field? So last season, I wildcarded in like 27 and free hit in 34 when most other like really good managers and probably like maybe a slightly better path would have been to wildcard in 35, which most people did. Now I got incredibly lucky. Whatever, that's irrelevant to the actual decision that I
Smart play,
made.
very good.
Yeah, irrelevant to the decision that I made was that I was trying to just be. I suppose the season wasn't going that well, or as well as I would have liked. Tried to just find some risk there without just buying terrible picks. Right, you see a lot that people even like at times like really good managers. I want to kind of increase my risk in the game. It's like, well, now I'm going to buy bad players. They might not admit that, and we all do it at times, myself included, right? But I end up saying, right, let me buy somebody who's just a worse pick, or somebody. This player is showing up 90% of my solves, but I don't really want to own them. I want to be a bit risky. It's probably not going to be the best play because you're probably going to be bleeding a decent amount of EV across the season. As I said, it kind of builds up and builds up, especially in the beginning of the season. You mentioned about price changes as well. If I'm wrong and if I pick the wrong player, a couple of seasons ago, quite anecdotal as well, where when Haaland first came and I started with triple Man City as well as a few other managers, and then we couldn't get to it, and all of a sudden he would gone up by whatever 0.5 within like 3 days, and so it kind of just it ramps up throughout the season, right?
I don't know if it was better or worse. I started with Haaland and then sold him in game week 3. I don't know why that was so. I swapped to Kane. I was like, nah, I'm gonna do it right. I was like, I don't know if that's better because you guys were stuck. You're like, oh, I can't reach him, and I was like, what if I sold him? So that was not well.
I think.
Sorry, go on. There's you can take a different path and play it quite well, and that just will gain you some different risk by being exposed to different players, or actually like it turns into a different interesting route. I think people don't, because we manage one team a season, and most people do, then you don't really realize quite how much of a butterfly effect a small move here or there can make. I know you and Rory had really similar teams, and then ended up he missed the deadline, and you ended up like 0.1 short of a move that he made, or vice versa, and suddenly you're like wild carding at different times and you're miles apart. And having played a few games where like multiple entries is part of the game in like fan team and stuff, I'm sure I had 2 very similar teams, and one of them I like bought a Dogi, and one of them I bought cash in as like my 5th defender in game week 5 with a transfer, and they ended up like wild carding at different times, and then they ended up wild card 2 at a different time, and like I didn't do anything that differently. So actually you kind of end up on a path or a rail more than you think. And actually these different moves can have these knock-on effects, and that's partly what you're trying to understand with the move. That's the evaluate the paths, not the players, is our new catchphrase from
it seems to be.
And actually, like, is this path really committing me one way or the other with this transfer? So if you can see, okay, there's 2 pretty different paths, and I see most people going this way, but this one looks pretty viable as well, then, and actually it provides some differences. So it exposes me to these players that other guys will have to miss, or vice versa. That's where your relative risk can come in without actually taking a huge amount of objective risk. The thing with the chips, especially last season, is that like there is a bit of objective risk because the path can sometimes not bear the fruit, I guess, in terms of like, okay, the EV looks pretty similar from here, but then we didn't really know what was going to happen with double game week 34, whether it was going to be massive or tiny or exist at all in some scenarios. So they can look similar, but actually you are taking a bet on the path making sense. Whereas through a set of single game weeks, then, there's not as much of a swing on that because the doubles and the blanks and the chips are the big ones. So I see some people looking at like a wildcard 4 is quite like a popular one of like either trying to be, well, I don't know if it is trying to be different or if everyone's going to do that. But I think it's the only wildcard time that really does stick out as a bit different, and the starting team's a bit different because you do kind of attack those first 3 weeks. Whereas a lot of the teams we were talking about before from wildcard 6 or 8, or even just generically around that period, or save it as long as you can, the starting teams all look pretty similar. So if you started with a team aiming at wildcard 8 and you got to 6 and you needed to pull the trigger, you've not really lost out hugely, other than maybe your players got injured. Whereas if you start with wildcard 4, then you wait till 6, then you do lose a bit, or vice versa. You start for 6 and wildcard in 4. So I do see some people trying to take that different path, but I don't know. There might be some more exciting different paths that someone might want to try.
Yeah, speaking of which, so alluded to this last week around
Oh dear.
the elusive bench boost 1, wildcard 2, and again the team and the exact players in here could be anyone at the same prices or similar. But in terms of here, for anybody listening, we have Raya and Allison, Trent, Gabriel, Pedro Porro, Saliba, Garnacho, Son, Bruno, Harvey Barnes has made an entry, Isaac, Darwin, Chris Wood, Gibbs White, and Lewis Hall. So a mixed bag. But I think it is an example of a path that might not end up, that might not be necessarily worse than any other path, right? It's just way different to what we see as the norm.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
I mean, there's a few cases for Bench Boost 1 every season that never quite come to fruition. But I guess basically the thing is like, okay, do you need a wild card out of it? And the fact that the wild card is going to be much less useful this season because of the way we can stack free transfers, then using the wild card in 2 is not super. It's competitive with playing it in other times. I guess you are more open to getting a bit stuck because you don't have your safety net of, oh crap, I was hoping to save it for later, but I can use my wildcard now. And actually, there are bench boost 1 wildcard 4 teams, bench boost 1 wildcard 6 teams, but the further you put the wildcard away, the less you're gaining from putting the bench boost in compared to not putting it in. So actually, bench boost 1 wildcard 4 might work as well. But the beauty of bench boost 1 wildcard 2 is that this is essentially a bench boost free hit team, and you can't do that any other way. Like you can't wildcard in 37 and bench boost in 38 because 37 is your wildcard 2, whereas free picking the team for bench boost then wildcarding is something that it's quite exciting. Like look at this mess that I've made.
When do you ever see Lewis Hall and Harvey Barnes?
Yeah, it allows you to stack because I think what people don't do as much on free hit that I like to do is like really building these stacks. So we've got triple Arsenal defense here. So like if you think Saka's not going to start game week 1, or he's a doubt or he's a mins risk, then you can really go against that. Some people might have Arsenal wildcard 4 guys might have double Arsenal defense, but if you've got triple, you're gaining huge if they keep a clean sheet, and you've got double Liverpool defense. I mean, anyone's got Raya and Allison. Son, you can double up on Newcastle attack. You can make a punt on a player if you think like, okay, they're only in for 1 week, and I'm pretty sure they are going to start game in 1. So I've put Harvey Barnes in, but that could be Murphy or it could be someone else, or it was just I just know that Barnes's projections are quite good if for some reason plays, so that's we're too far out. There's 2 Newcastle games this weekend. Newcastle attacker. But actually, like this does come out comparably, and actually compared to playing just the wild card early, you can gain around 12 to 13 EV from the bench boost, which is lower than we've generally valued it at. And I think last season, I can't remember exactly what we played at. I think it was 2 seasons ago. You could basically gain like 20 on it. It was bench boost 29 or something because we wildcarded into it, and you could get pretty much 15 doublers. But the double is going to be much smaller. So, and we've got a mystery chip. I don't know what the hell that is. But the doubles being smaller means that like maybe the bench boost doesn't necessarily have to be in a double game week. I think looking at it last year, a few people played bench boost outside of 37, and actually the main gain I see from bench boosting in a double game week is not just that like, okay, if a player misses 1 game and gets the other one, that's fine. Whereas if they miss a player here, then I'm down a player. But also if you can get 2 doubling goalkeepers even in a bad fixture tend to still get 3 to 3.5 EV. So a second doubling goalkeeper means your bench has 6 to 7 EV for even a pretty crap keeper. So actually a double game week goalkeeper plus 3 good single game week fixtures. I think mine might have even had a double and 2 good Arsenal players on it. And a lot of people under that because Arsenal doubled in 34. But you do miss out on that. So a bench boost could be worth 15 or 16 EV. I don't think it's going to be worth 20 this season. That would just be pretty unlikely. It'd have to all align perfectly. Maybe the mystery chip lets you do that. I don't know. So you're kind of betting, what, 3 or 4 EV here that, like, cause, I mean, it might be that the bench boost that people use later is 12 or 13 EV, and actually you've gone, okay, like I've
Also,
matched you, and
you
I've
also
gone
don't need to
somewhere
like
weirdly.
you don't need to work towards it, right? Like you don't
Yeah.
you
So
might
can make
you might
games
have
outside,
you might have 16 EV in your bench boost in whatever, let's say I don't know 34 or something this season, but maybe you have to bleed 2 EV across the 6 weeks before that or something as you kind of
So
have to take certain paths. I think the biggest thing with the double game, having it in a double, for me, it's like bad players are less bad. You know, like they're okay to have in your squad. You know, because they got 2 games, like you said, the cheap goalkeeper or whatever. Even if you know, a cheap mid who's just a 4.5 mid is pretty decent in a double game week, right? You know, whatever, like 4.5 or 5 EV or whatever it might be. So just like kind of it just feels nice to have like bad players feel like less bad, and I suppose it's just exciting as well to have it in a double game week. But equally as exciting is your game week 1's squad having 15 players playing, right?
Brilliant. Yeah, and actually, like, you can do some, you know, like this. I tried to make it a bit differential here. Like, if you just did a raw solve, it's going to be I was going to say more sensible. It's not very sensible, but the point is that you could take this very different path, and it still be something that is something you can play it quite well, and you know, you get a huge amount of relative risk with something like this. So I think if someone is really looking at an early wildcard in 4, then I certainly have a tinker and see what bench boost 1 with that looks like, or whether wildcard 2 looks nice to you, or so I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, so similarly, I think if you're that type of player who like really wants to find a differential or something, you know, like if that's just like naturally something, an inclination that you always have, and you find yourself thinking, right, how am I going to do something different? How am I going to get a different player, a different captain every week, rather than necessarily, to be honest, making your team worse at times. This is an option, right? It's just one sample, but it is an option here.
You can use the sample of good players without picking an unusual asset in a way that, well, I guess I've got Darwin in there, but in a way that still lets you be really different. So also, if you're bored, you do this. Well, like a nice start to the season. If you want something to hold over your managers all season, like, oh, I played free hit 7 and it didn't work, but it should have worked, then this one's for you, I think.
Yeah. Again, another one here that I'm just gonna bring up. Again, the players themselves. I mean, whatever. Well, again, more discussion, I guess, needed on that next week. But this is kind of a general kind of structure that you've been kind of considering, I guess, so far as something that's different to the field and a way to find some of that relative risk. I guess pretty much every single draft you see, either Salah or Haaland are in there, and you'd probably say, you know, what's everybody running? One of those, probably Haaland, whatever, doesn't really matter, but they probably have one of those players. And so we have one here with none. That again is a really good team. Now, whether personally, I probably wouldn't go for a team without Salah or Haaland. I wouldn't go for one with both, but I wouldn't go for one with neither myself. But it is a team that you've been looking at. So just for anybody listening, we have the 2 Brentford keepers in goal: Trent, Gabriel, Pedro Porro, Dunk and Konza. Then in midfield, we have Nkunku, Son, Bruno, Eze and Saka. So a fairly standard midfield. You might think no Salah and maybe Son is in there or something like that. And then up front, Isak, Tony and Muniz. So again, Isak and Muniz, very popular. Again, the prices and stuff and the actual players don't really matter. But it doesn't have Salah, it doesn't have Haaland, but it has other good players in the team, right? What are you thinking around that?
Yeah, I think I've a few group chats where people are like discussing different drafts and they're sort of sharing their new iterations, and I'm sort of thinking like, well, actually, once I started looking, we don't know what the assets are. So kind of Tony was like, oh, maybe it's Tony, maybe it's Solanke. If Solanke had joined and looks good for Spurs off the start, then that's a good one. But actually, starting with Tony, moving to Solanke looked quite nice. You can even hop to Darwin if he's looking good. So yeah, it's more the kind of the player structures, and actually, like, is this sort of price point something that's quite nice? And I think actually, like, once you really boil it down, there probably are only 3, maybe 4 types or builds of drafts.
Yeah.
So, and it's those big pieces in first. It's like when you put the rocks in the bottle and then fit the sand around it, you can fill the jar. And if you put the sand in first, it doesn't work. So I put the sand in first here, so I couldn't fit to take that away. But yeah, I mean, they come up quite competitively. I think the Salah and Haaland one is, well, it's too expensive. I think you are really playing quite fragile there.
The team just sucks.
It
seems awful.
I don't like it. I would be very surprised if I ended up on that, unless lots of great 4.0 defenders suddenly start when we've really got a couple. But I think the nomium, as people are calling it, is quite pretty competitive. I think it also stands up pretty well because actually, like, you've got a pretty robust 15.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are trying to save transfers and actually like save your wild card and maybe jump around, you can still get to Salah in 5 if you wanted to move a few players around. Maybe like Saka drops out ahead of their game against City and game week 5. You can move a few pieces about. Isak could even drop down after he's played. So
probably more likely for you to have more transfers with a team like this as well. You might think.
Yeah. So I like if I do have an injury to Eze or Nkunku isn't playing, then I've still got good players like Konsa and Dunk, especially in some of their better fixtures, are still pretty good. That's the guy you might even buy. So it's much more likely to be able to just stick a player away on the bench for a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think like playing around with actually, I don't think any of the wildcard timings stick out enough in the sort of near horizon of 2 to 8 that one of them is going to be way better. Obviously, last season it sort of popped out because suddenly we had double game week 7. But I don't think any of them are like clear, and actually they're not even that way ahead of running through. Yeah. So actually, like trying to save it if you can, I think is probably how I'm going to play. And also because the team's not dissimilar, apart from Salah and Haaland, to a lot of the people who are trying to wildcard around then if I get to that point and things go wrong and I have to pull the wildcard, I'll be ready to do that because it's a good opportunity. And actually jumping on a different fixture swing is good. That's fine. I can play wildcard 6 if it looks like I need to.
Yeah, I think just to touch on that as well, you kind of mentioned it earlier as well, that the teams, they're not very different, right? So if I'm building a team that doesn't intend to make many transfers and doesn't have a particular wildcard time in mind. The only wildcard that I'm really losing EV on if I end up doing it is like game week 4 or game week 3 or something, right? Like something really, really early. If I wildcard in game week 6 or 7 or 8, my team is virtually the same as everybody else's who's gone into game week 1 planning for wildcard 6. So when I say I'm planning to hold the wildcard, it's not that I'm like, oh my god, there's no way I would ever wildcard in game week 6. If I need to, and if the EV looks great when we get there, I will. And my team will be the same as the people who plan to do that, or more or less, right? But maybe if it's just kind of a general. Just when you mentioned it there, I said I jump in on that. And yeah, I think probably while we're on chip timing and things like that, we might as well, because I'm trying to kind of avoid speaking about free transfer value for some reason, because I know we're talking about it later, so we might as well just move on to it now. It just makes sense. I'm trying to kind
of... It's the big topic.
Yeah, exactly. 5 free transfers, big change, and also being able to roll through a wildcard. So for me, when I first saw that we could roll up to 5 free transfers and also roll through a... roll to 5 free transfers and roll through a wildcard, I thought immediately, okay, I'm wildcarding early, right? Like whatever that might be, 3 or 4 or something. Immediately, that's what I thought, because, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but if I know I'm going to wildcard in game week 4, that means that I'm going to have a team that's going to be really, really good for game week 1 to 3, better than a non-wildcard 4 team for sure. And so there's going to be a very good chance that I can set myself up to have 3 free transfers when I get to game week 4. And so then, using that wild card, I can then try and get up to 4 or 5 and so on, because you'd imagine after a wild card, I should have a team that I can roll with for 2 weeks and get to 5 or something, right? But then we found out, from my point of view, that there's a chip blooming in 6 months that's coming, and we have no idea what it does. And like, jokes aside, I don't know what it does, and there is some EV in that uncertainty, right? There's something in there. I don't know what that number is, but there's some EV there in that chip, in having a wild card to prepare for that chip. What it is, I don't know. What the chip is, I don't know. But there's something there, and so I'd be kind of on the side of trying to save it if I can, and being able to react to that. And hopefully, when it comes out, having a wildcard will be really useful. It might not, but yeah, that was my thinking initially. I suppose I touched on most of my kind of intuitive feelings around free transfer value last week. That I guess for me, really, really important to get to like 3 or 4, whatever the number might be. Really, really important at the beginning to roll, and as you get further and further down, and as you gain more and more free transfers in your bank, that it becomes, I suppose, less valuable. And I'd be more willing to use transfers when I have 3 or 4 in the bank. What were your thoughts, kind of when it first came out? How has that kind of developed, I guess, over the last 3 weeks, and how do you think that's going to affect your kind of planning going forward?
Yeah, so again, like when I first heard about it, my first thought was, okay, like early wildcard's going to be the play because I hadn't read the rules properly and I hadn't realized you could roll through them. So I was like, oh, 5 free transfers. Okay, that means I'm going to like wildcard early and then start banking them. Because if I have a
Yeah,
bank and then have my wildcard to use, I've got a dead end in a funny way. And maybe that's not as good.
yeah,
But then I was like, oh, you can roll through them. And I was like, that's something I've just not really come across because I've played other games where you can, a fan team, you can roll unlimited. I've played other games where there's like, you have a stock of transfers to use across the season, play them at your own pace. So I was like, I'm familiar with the concept of not being quite as restricted as we are in FPL with the transfers. So I thought, okay, maybe that's, but then this rolling through a wild card is like, wow, weird. And I think that's like the only way that people are actually going to get to 5 transfers. I think is like roll 2 or 3 wild card, roll 2 or 3. I don't think anyone's going to roll 5 in a row.
yeah,
I think that's just that you're giving up too much. Something's going to happen. Like even last year, even in those games where you set up going like, okay, I want to try and roll for a while. People make transfers in like game week 2, 3 because Reece James is injured
yeah,
and then Luke Shaw is injured, and then you're like, okay, well, there's a valuable transfer here. I know it's valuable to save them, but there's a pretty valuable thing I should do now, so I'll do that.
yeah,
So I think, yeah, the idea of like um transfers being more valuable makes sense to me because we're less restricted with them. So I have more chance of like, oh, I don't have to use this now. I can use this in a few weeks' time. Whereas before it was almost like, well, if I don't use it this week, I kind of have to use it next week. I can't roll 2 in a row. I can't do 2 weeks of doing nothing. So if I don't use it now,
yeah,
I have to do something. I don't have to use both, but I have to do something. Whereas if you have 34 transfers, or whatever it's going to be without the chips, to use whenever you want, then they're pretty valuable because you can just put them in the 34 most valuable spots. And obviously, you don't know that exactly because you might leave yourself one short and then a player gets injured, and then you go, okay, well, that's never mind. But if you had pure foresight, then the 34 would be pretty unlikely you're going to use one a week. Like that, you'd spread them out. You'd have big chunks here, and you'd be doing all sorts. So the fact that the first couple are more valuable, I think, is made intuitive sense to me. And then as well, like it tapering off, I think getting towards this third, fourth, fifth, and actually like how does it jump from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, and does that actually have a different value, or is a static one going to make sense?
yeah,
So we started doing some like research with Sertalp and James Trout, which I can't reveal all the details of, but essentially we were like playing through the season, pretty similar with varying values and seeing how they were scoring.
using like this previous seasons, right? Like using,
Yes, yeah. So
yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
So you take
yeah,
last season's expected value data and you play through as if you were a machine who never made a transfer above. Sorry, if it's worth less than 1.5. And that's kind of how we got to the 1.5 free transfer value we used a lot before, and the
yeah,
0.84 decay is actually. I'm gonna shout out Trout's work here. Is actually like that was research he'd done on playing through the season and using varying parameters of free transfer value and decay and seeing how they interact and seeing which ones played better through a season. So I think we were like, okay, let's try and do something similar and see does like a flat value work or like a decaying value. And I think like the initial showings are that like actually some sort of higher at the start and lower at the end is marginally better, but it's not actually as much better as you
yeah,
might think, and we're still tinkering around. But the early results are backing up the thought that the free transfers are more valuable when you have fewer of them and less valuable when you have
yeah,
lots, which is kind of I think what people had landed on.
yeah,
But yeah, it's interesting to kind of play around and do some
yeah,
research and sometimes we have something that kind of like, oh, our intuition is showing this, and then you get some data and it sort of goes the other way, and you think about why, and then you realize there's a bug in the test, and you go, okay, I'll do something else. But yeah, I think it makes some sense to you. Like if I have
Yeah.
two, not only do I have twice as many, but I can do a positional switch. I can move funds around more easily, and the same with three. I can move stuff around
Yeah.
much better than whereas some other games, like you don't have a bench, you have 11, and you can move a midfielder to a forward, so that positional flexibility and funds around is not as important. Whereas here, then yeah, if I want to move Salah to Haaland, I need two transfers unless
Yeah.
I'm doing like a setup thing. So a compounding effect going against okay, I don't want to pass up too much now, is kind of the opposing forces of what's pulling transfer values all over the place. But it's quite hard to measure because also like unless the transfer, your top transfer is around that threshold, like if you set a threshold of 2 and your best transfer is 3.5, it didn't matter whether you set it at 2 or 1.5, just make the transfer. Which is where hits come in. Like if a transfer is worth more than 4, just do it, because like it's,
Yeah.
if you make a hit later, you're still up. But like because I think we're gonna so rarely get to 3, 4, well 4 and 5, then the transfer value for those is like fiddly. But
Yeah,
have
I
a,
think
have a look.
the way that I've been kind of wrecking my head over it at times and whatever else. I think to be honest, probably more so than needed. But there's nothing else to do at the minute, so I mean, why not? I think some of the work that, as you mentioned, Sir Talp and James have done in the past on free transfer value and continue to do, and just in FPL in general, is amazing. And I'm sure at some point this season we'll be able to get to a stage where we're really, really confident in what our values might be for free transfer, depending on how many you have and whatever else. From my point of view, I don't really feel that way now, confident in any particular value, really. So what I've been doing a decent amount of time, and what I'd recommend really, if you're not sure on how to approach this, is as I would do in the past, and I would probably just suggest to anyone playing FPL anyways, is pick a really robust team that doesn't plan many transfers, right? If you're solving and you're just seeing transfer after transfer every week, it's probably not going to be the best line for you to take. Maybe if you were wildcarding in 4 or something, that would be different, because you'd want to be a little bit more aggressive there. But in general, let's say you're planning even a wildcard, I don't know, 8 or that period of time after 6, let's say, a path that doesn't have that many transfers could be really useful, and that could be done by, I guess, increasing your free transfer value. For me, I've either been like running on a lower solve depth or restricting free transfers, the number of transfers that can be used, whatever. It doesn't really matter. All I want is a line that comes up and I don't see that many transfers, right? Because at the end of the day, that means that the team that it picks in game week 1 is really, really good, and is quite robust and has a deep bench, right? The values themselves, I don't know, and more intelligent people than me, I'm sure, will get there working on that kind of backdated EV over previous seasons, and I don't see why that wouldn't be the best way to approach that. One thing I might mention, and I suppose get your thoughts on as well, around, I know we spoke about this earlier on, about kind of, let's say when you have 4 free transfers saved, if you get there. Now, I don't think any of us really will get there unless it's with a wild card, but let's say you do. I don't really think that the value of rolling from 4 to 5 is much different to rolling from 1 to 2 last season. Much different, because I mean, at the end of the day, when you have 1 free transfer in a previous season, you can either roll or you can make a move. Now, if I have 4 free transfers, I can either roll to 5 or I can make a move or moves. So I do think that it brings down the value a little bit, but I don't think really it's changed that much. And I think stressing about should it be 1.5 or 1.3 or 1.2 until we have data that really, really backs that up, I don't think it really matters. Just pick something that's like generally kind of high. And if you want to, if you're working on a solver on your own, maybe decrease it a little bit over the few weeks. But until we have something that kind of is really kind of research driven, I don't think that there's too much point, again, using our own pea brains to try and just like come up with 5 random values. I don't know what you think on that.
Yeah, I think like if it's putting loads of scheduled transfers in, then yeah, you're pretty fragile with that, because like you're not going to end up doing that path. You come up with a path And I think you forget what your path was last week, because by the time you get to the following week, you're like, oh, it's all different.
I can't afford him now, right?
Well, yeah. Well, for one, yeah.
Yeah.
So you very rarely go like, oh yeah, this is the path that I was on before. Like the paths are changing every week.
Yeah.
Which as well, I think, is why sometimes like your best move might be something that is quite valuable, but most of the value comes later on.
Yeah.
So this is something I would normally try and do when I was playing fan team, was like, okay, this is probably my best move, but the week right now is it's not really adding much, if anything. So maybe it's like less than 0.5, or it's swapping a bench player out. Is like, sure, I can do that. Well, sorry, prices might affect that. If he's rising in price, maybe I'll buy them. But I can just do that next week now. I don't have to go like, oh, I need to do that now because otherwise I'll waste it or I'll avoid a setup thing. But he'd be like, oh, if this is still the right move next week, then what have I lost by waiting, or point something?
Yeah.
Obviously, if it's like, okay, he comes in and he's the captain and he's a lot of EV this week, then the amount you're losing by waiting is quite a lot. So even some of the moves that are valuable over the horizon are stuff that you can just go, I'll just wait, I'll do it next week. Which is something that doesn't really happen in some of the other games like Sky, because you're trying to gain fixtures with that. So actually you can't just do it next week. You have to have them in the right order. But in FPL, like just if there's not a lot to do, or even your best move is not improving your team much this week, just roll it.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, you touched on. Sorry, I don't mean to jump in, but just seeing as you're touching on fan team there, and I know it's a game that you've played quite a lot. I haven't played myself, but I'd be fairly in tune with the rules and kind of how the game works, as far as I can understand. You can roll as many transfers as you want, so you could roll every single game week if you wanted to. And again, I'll leave more of the explanation to you, but I think you can wildcard at some point, but there's no free hit. So what I'm just going to bring up here is a little kind of graph and a table that you pulled together from, I believe, the top 10 managers from last season in Fan Team. And the graph on the bottom here, for those who can't, who are listening and aren't able to see, we have a graph representing how many free transfers those top 10 managers had over the season. And what we can see is, I think 2 managers at any point in the season had 4 free transfers. Everybody else, for the most part, again, just to explain what's in the graph, hovered around 2 to 3 free transfers, mainly 2. A lot of people had 3 free transfers and things like that. In terms of the distribution, how many transfers people had going into a game week, again, just to read the values on the table, managers who had 1 free transfer, was 50% of the time people had 1 free transfer in a game week. I think I'm getting that right, am I?
Yeah, so this is like the number of transfers that you have when you enter that game week.
Yes.
So obviously they all start with 1 in game week 2, because you can't have rolled in 1. You start in the season.
So we have 1. Yeah, so people 50% of the time people had 1 free transfer going into a game week. 33% of the time people had 2 free transfers going into a game week. 14% of the time, more or less, people had 3 free transfers. 2.5% people had 4 free transfers, and 0% of the time the top 10 managers in Fan Team from last season had 5 free transfers. Nobody who finished in the top 10 last season had 5 free transfers. So yeah.
So the caveat here is obviously that we had quite a lot of double game weeks, and we don't have the chips that we can use. So actually we can navigate a big blank game week much easier in FPL, because we have a free hit or a wild card, or you free hit in the big double. Or
and it's 1 wild card in Fan Team, is that right? Throughout the whole season?
It's 2. You still get 1.
Okay.
It's like one first half, 1 second half.
Yeah.
But if you think back to how difficult going from 25 to 29 to 34 to 37 was last year, from the mini double with City and Liverpool to the big blank to the 2 doubles, like if you had 1 wild card to basically manage that, then that's why almost everyone ended up on this strategy of wild card in 30 or 31. So you dead end into 29, wild card there, and then bank 3 or 4 transfers, as you can see, and then use that to manage the 34 to 37 switch. Is what a lot of people did. But that was the only time people actually got to 4. So even though right at the start of the season, you're like, okay, I'm going to want to roll some, then people were making, like, some of them were making transfers in game week 2 because they had something to fix.
And you couldn't, you can't roll through the wildcard in Fan Teams, all right?
Can't roll through the wildcard. So that is the only other thing. So, like, obviously, having a big bank in game week 4 is because you've passed some stuff up in the early few weeks is not as useful as it is now, because you're going to have to use them to dead end into your wild card whenever you play it. So I think it was just that I thought, okay, like this is similar because it's got that rolling approach, and I wanted to just see, was this actually going to show us anything? Were the top managers, and a lot of them are names are recognized, so they are good managers rather than just someone who fluked their way into the top 10. So this is the single entry. I would say this is an 18 plus website, so gamble awareness, all of that.
I think for the most part it's just to reflect that.
I'm not encouraging people to play the game, but it's a similar
just to reflect that there is another
game
that has
with some good managers, and this is the behavior that we saw. And actually, this distribution of having 1 about half the time, and 2 about a third of the time, and 3 about an eighth of the time, kind of does match with the better performing free transfer values that we've done in our tests. They do tend to kind of end up at this rough distribution, and actually the ones where the value is a bit too low, you end up with 1s and 2s a bit too often because you've been a little bit too greedy. And if it's too high, then you end up with a skewed where you do end up in the sort of 4 or 5 region a few times, and actually you've passed up too much EV. So I think this is something that Sertal touched on in his pod yesterday. But yeah, that balance, I think, around this. So it's not like, okay, I'm gonna play in such a way that I fit this distribution, but it gives us an idea of like, okay, about half the time I'm gonna just have 1 transfer left still. Rather than actually, like, I think some people were perhaps getting a bit excited about, great, I'm going to roll straight to 4 and then just sit there, and be like, well, maybe we can't do that. But obviously, you could, from the start of the season, roll wild cards, roll and be on 4 or 5, which you can't do in this game.
I think just shows like
it's close.
The overwhelming majority of us won't see more than 3 or 4 transfers, right? With the wild card, it might be a little bit more, but again, just a game that kind of similar. Again, whether you play it or not is irrelevant, and again, an 18 plus game, blah blah blah, etc. etc. But it's just there is a game out there, that allows you to roll more than 2 free transfers, and this is the results of some of the good managers in there. And that nobody saw 5 free transfers. I think that's just like an interesting kind of thing to take.
I think we sometimes get a little narrow-minded with FPL because it is the most popular one, but there are lots of other games out there that have different mechanics, and people react to those and adapt to those. So when we have a rule change, then it is worth looking at other games and seeing.
Yeah, it's easy to think, look at this crazy idea where you can roll more than 2 free transfers. It's groundbreaking moves.
No, I played a game like this. Rolling through a wild card is pretty crazy. I've not seen that in any game unless it was a broken one. But that's why I quite enjoy playing different games too. Is actually you learn more about fantasy mechanics and playing different leagues. They've got different chips and all that stuff. But FPL is good, and it's where most people are. So.
Yeah, I think generally just the takings from what I take from this conversation, anyways. Your thoughts generally align with mine, and for the most part, if you're not wildcarding earlier, I mean, make a flexible plan that probably intends to roll to 3 or 4 transfers. Things will probably change that mean you don't do that, and that's fine. But be in a situation that you can roll your transfers, a flexible team, and there isn't that much difference between a wildcard 6 or an 8 or an unplanned wildcard. Right? Sure, the game week 4, if you want to be really aggressive, that is a path that could be really, really good, and probably a little bit of relative risk in there, which is great. So if that's something you're after, again, if you're somebody who hunts for differentials and things like that, pick a different path rather than just picking a worse player. I think that's what I take from it. Anything I'm missing in terms of the major ideas there for like approaching game week 1, let's say?
Yeah, I think just like sometimes a tip for interpreting the outputs of a solver is that if it's not putting a transfer in, that's not saying you will roll that week.
Yeah.
That's just saying like you will either roll or you'll make a generic transfer that has become valuable at that point. Or what we used to see last year is like, to avoid burning, you do something. So by the time you get there, something will be more valuable or worth doing. So actually a path that has very few transfers in is robust because it allows you to be ready to make those things as they come up, rather than saying like, yes, I will stick with this team forever, I'll never do anything with it.
Yeah.
So that's actually just a different way of which makes sense. It's just I think sometimes people might look at the paths or the outputs and slightly miss that point. But
Yeah.
yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I think for the most part that kind of covers stuff around, I guess, the main idea, the main things we wanted to touch on: risk, X-Mins, a couple of drafts and different paths and things like that, which kind of tied in with risk, as well as then our free transfer valuation. Again, be robust and be flexible, and you're going to be fine. Just hope that you get lucky in the season, right? Just like pick a team that's flexible and just hope that things go right.
Play better than everyone else.
Yeah, just play better. Just simply choose to get the points, right? Just decide, I want the points, and get the points. That's it. There's no more to it. Some people don't do that. There's about, I don't know, at least 10 people in here who do that regularly, who don't choose to get the points. I see John Doe, Sam, Blues FPL. I think Sir Tal popped in as well, another manager who just doesn't really choose to get the points, but that's okay. Like, you play your own game, right? At the end of the day, it's a game of fun. So if you don't want to get points, that's fine. You can be like those managers, but if you want to get points, then we're the people to listen to.
One.
Yeah,
think how many points that's going to be. Be loads.
It's definitely going to be more than if you didn't bench boost one, right? Simple, quite simply put.
Well, you say that. I've seen wildcards go wrong where your team does worse. I'm not sure I've seen
I've seen free hits as well, particularly Gimmick 29, where a lot of managers last season didn't choose to get the points. I think you might have done that. Is that right?
I think everyone didn't do that. I did pick David Datro Fofana, who scored a goal. That was there. No one else had him.
Yeah, the real Chads wildcard are free hit it in 34, and they were the ones who had who chose for the points. Yeah, I think for the most part that kind of covers everything, I guess, for the day. It's a fairly lengthy-ish pod and kind of detailed, but I think that's kind of just the nature of what we're discussing. So it's always going to be that way, where, again, some research that's been done on from your guys' end with James and with Sertalp and Jorgen, and it's, I really, really appreciate that you could share some of that with us. Obviously not all, because it's not out yet, right? But it's nice to get some sort of insights that
got all the answers yet.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so I really do appreciate it, because it is nice to hear that there's at least some testing that's been done that in some way kind of backs up my kind of intuition towards it, and the intuition of like most kind of fairly engaged managers. Sertal pretending that he likes points in the chat there, but I haven't seen that proof yet. I know, I haven't seen it yet. So maybe this season will be yours, Sertal, but I do highly doubt it. But yeah, Johnny, I really, really appreciate you coming on. It was really, really nice to chat with you. Again, if you want to give a final plug to the newsletter,
yes, fploptimized.com/sign-up, link in the description. We'll be posting updates, but yeah, we've got a new tool coming out we're working on, very excited about. Should be out early 2025. And yes, if you're a Chelsea, City, or Spurs fan, or any of the other big teams, do get in touch about our prediction stuff with Emma as well.
Yeah.
So that's me or Emma, who's at Jump the Wave.
Yeah, and should all be in the description.
And like and subscribe to Inspected Goals, and go get points.
Yeah, get points. Again, whether that will be coming with the tool, I don't know, but it could be a bit of fun.